same stage section of the chat window to post your questions. Right? Yeah. So I would like to introduce now to our esteemed speaker, Ramkumar Narayanan. Ram is a global leader focusing on data-driven digital product innovation spanning consumer and enterprise markets. Ram brings a vast experience in product development, product management, and product marketing, having led both new market entry and turnaround of existing business areas. He has been an advisor for enterprises, large and small, in the arena of digital transformation, product strategy, and product marketing. Ram is currently the VP and Managing Site Director R&D at VMware India. Prior to joining VMware, he served in global leadership positions at eBay, Yahoo, and Microsoft. Today, Ram would be sharing his insights on the role of innovation during the time of crisis. Over to you, Ram.
All right. Good morning, everyone, and fantastic talk by Seema. And I've always been inspired by every time I listen to her. All right. Thank you again for having me here. It's always a pleasure for me to address this audience every year. And thank you, Usha, for your confirmation of those talks have gone well. So today my topic, and if you could bring the slides up, that'd be great, Ramya. So today my topic is really about innovation in the time of crisis, and I don't think we could have picked a better topic for the time that we are in, right? And it's and I've been looking at this over the last few months to understand what has happened in the past and what can we learn from that as we look into the future, both as organizations as well as individuals. So that's really where I'm going to focus my talk today, and I hope it leaves you with some thoughts on what we could be doing as we look ahead. Okay, so as we move forward, if you could go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the things, if you look back in history, it has actually been quite clear that organizations that continue to innovate during times of crisis have come out of it much better, right? I mean, even during the time of crisis, organizations that have continued to innovate and people who in those organizations who have continued to innovate, there's a clear indication that they do well during the crisis as well as they come out of the crisis, they outperform their peer group that perhaps wasn't spending as much time in a crisis. I mean, there's a good lesson to be learned here in the sense that, while the natural inclination when we think about a crisis is to pull back, right? Get protective around us. I mean, that's a natural instinct that all of us have. But this actually flies in the face of that to say that, look, it's a good time to start investing. And I'll talk about some of the examples of where, in times of crises, as people have come, during the crisis and after the crisis, a lot of things, good things have happened in organizations as well as in the industry as we look ahead. So moving on to the next slide. If you think about some of the examples that we have here, if you could move to the next slide. Great. So let me pick a couple of crisis scenarios that existed before the current pandemic. Right? If you think back to the SARS, back in 2002, there was a tremendous amount of uplift in e-commerce. So if you think about Asia, which probably got impacted the most during the SARS epidemic, particularly China and Hong Kong and those kind of places. If you look at a company like Alibaba, right? If you look at Alibaba's revenue growth between 2010 and 2015, the 5 years during, kind of just at the crisis levels and beyond. And actually, if you look back in history at Alibaba, over the 10-year period that covered probably around 2002 to around 2015 or so, 10 plus years, their revenue growth was, almost 100%. And the reason for that, and you saw a number of companies in China come up through e-commerce, and it became like a hotbed of e-commerce only because of the fact that during the crisis, people got into a lockdown, as we are all familiar with when you get into a lockdown. And even in India today, if you think back, if you look at what has helped us during the crisis time, has really been e-commerce, the delivery of delivery of essentials that the delivery companies of various sorts have been able to come and bring it to your doorstep without you having to go out and expose yourself. I think the same thing happened in 2002 during the SARS epidemic, where there is a massive upshift in terms of e-commerce growth in the Asian markets because of the crisis. Now that's a great example, and to to think about it, what is it? Not that it doesn't exist before that, but the uptake became dramatically more. Even in India, if you look at the growth of e-commerce on a regular basis. So typically, I think e-commerce, the way they track it is they look at number of buyers who buy at least once a month, right? Now, if you look at that same buyer who used to buy once in a month or once in a few months, has suddenly shifted and now they're buying on a weekly basis. So, there is a dramatic shift that starts to happen during a time of crisis. The second thing is when you think about, the financial crisis of 2009, what happened was there was a number of extra assets that people had. I mean, they had houses, they had they have various sort, they had cars that were assets that were sitting around, and people weren't really didn't know what to unlock it. And that was really the growth that came up in the marketplaces business, the gig economy. If you think about it, really started around the time frame of the financial crisis, because people needed alternate methods of income, and they looked at some of their assets and said, hey, I have a room in my house. Can I lend it out to somebody to come and stay? I had an extra house somewhere, and there's a way for me to pay the mortgage by renting it out on a timeshare basis. Can I have a car? And Uber started coming up and said, look, I have a car and I have time on my hands. Can I actually start using it to earn some money for me? And that's really what, there was a huge impetus. And that's just one example during the financial crisis. There's a number of others. And if you looked at companies in that time frame, not just the startups, the gig economy startups, but the more traditional companies. I mean, the Googles of the world, the Facebooks of the world, they had a tremendous upsurge, a few years after the financial crisis. So as we think about the current COVID-19 crisis that is going on, the question is, what could be those kinds of businesses that could come out of it? As we think about it, right? So, for example, could it be in healthcare? Could it be in education? I mean, education, ed tech has existed for a while, but there were really no uptake. I mean, it was okay. I mean, people who used to experiment with it, maybe for tuition classes or learning music, remotely or things like that. But suddenly you're front and center. I mean, the healthcare, health tech, it's front and center in the middle of this crisis, right? So what could that be as we look ahead? And what are the kinds of things that we should be thinking about? It could be talent landscape, could be completely changed, it could be retail. Any one of these, it's worth thinking about. What could be the next wave, next big wave over the next 5, 10 years that that could potentially change the way we live and work. So I think it's worth thinking about this in this crisis. What would we think back 10 years from now and say, hey, the COVID-19 crisis really gave birth to all these new areas that we weren't thinking about even before that, right? Or weren't really, we had did a big uptake, but suddenly it's just changed the landscape of what we're trying to do. We move to the next slide. Okay, so here are some, examples. If you look at the crisis and what could play a role in offering, learnings and innovation opportunities. For example, digital manufacturing. Now, the manufacturing industry, if you think about it in current crisis, is ripe for disruption. One, the level of, it's becoming very clear that the human beings are the weak link in the chain, right? I mean, so when we think about manufacturing of the future, automation, robotics, and all kinds of new things, would start to play a part. 3D printing. I mean, 3D printing is a democratization of the manufacturing process in a lot of ways, because people with the 3D printer, which are getting cheaper and cheaper by the day, you could start printing goods in your own house at some point, right? So 3D printing, even today in the crisis, if you think about some of the innovation that's happening around, masks and face shields and all kinds of things, it's being enabled by the 3D printing process, because the designer can be completely in a different part of the world. Manufacturing can happen somewhere else, and all you need is the file that you download and be able to run it through a 3D printer that creates those goods. There is no reason now to have a whole value chain and a supply chain available. That will manufacture will happen in one place, design will happen in another place, and then it has to be shipped to a third place in order to sell it. You can download and start using it directly. Second is EdTech. I touched upon this. If you think about our own lives today, some of you have kids, or you may have others in your family who are going through remote education. I mean, just in a span of 5 months, remote education has become is no longer the sidelight that used to happen in the periphery of regular education. It is front and center. Whether you're in school or college or otherwise, or you're reskilling yourself, EdTech is now playing a massive role in terms of looking at how this is going to grow. In some cases, you may never go back to the traditional method of working. People are starting to question the value of a college degree. Are you really paying this large amount of money for a degree, or can you just go online and skill yourself and be able to get a job? Now, I don't know we don't know how this is going to play itself out. There are challenges. I mean, it is not very inclusive if you think about socioeconomic segments. Not everybody's got a laptop or a computer or even a smartphone. And how do they participate? Are we going to leave them behind, or is there a way for them to bring them forward? So, a large amount of innovation is yet to happen in the tech space, but a big boost is happening because of the current crisis. The third is innovation for the masses. I mean, my labs, this example here is my labs from Pune. During the time of the crisis, when it was just starting up in March, within a few weeks, they were able to come up with a rapid test that and start to manufacture this at scale. And they have continued that innovation process, and they are starting to build out now molecular testing capabilities that can be now sent out to rural areas at a very cheap cost, so that you don't need to, this doesn't become the domain of cities anymore. Now, mass testing and ability to detect new healthcare issues and be able to remediate it becomes much more democratized, and they're able to, get penetrated into deep parts of, India, for example. But this can be exported to any market, right? I mean, so it drives a lot more inclusivity as well. So innovation is not just about for a tip of the iceberg or for a very small segment of the audience. It is really about making it mass and bringing it forward. And every example I've given you till now, e-commerce, again, same thing. It's becoming mass adoption, and even people of lower, mid socioeconomic segments or lower are starting to participate and use it. Same thing with, manufacturing. Now there are downsides. I won't say that everything is a, silver lining here, because it is going to have implications on jobs. It's going to have an implication on careers. It's going to have an implication on, financial situations of a lot of people who used to live in a different world. And now, as we look ahead, it is going to change. And the question is, how can we be more inclusive in terms of bringing those people along with us as these changes are starting to happen? Okay, so let's move to the next slide. So here's another innovation. I mean, this didn't start in a crisis, well, unless you want to call demonetization a crisis in some sense, but UPI, right? I mean, this is our own UPI. I don't know about the rest of you, but I haven't touched cash in 6 months or 5 months since March, right? I haven't had the need to. I have not visited a bank or an ATM since that time. And how is that even possible? That's, UPI is a massive enabler. So it is a massive enabler for all of us. I think it's mass adoption of UPI. They just crossed 1.5 billion transaction on a monthly basis in July, and that is double from last year. So this is a massive innovation. We are proud from VMware that we play a small part in the way NPCI manages its infrastructure. But UPI by itself is a massive innovation, right? I mean, it has the ability to make cost zero for both the merchant and for the consumer, and while at the same time be able to bring in people into, inclusiveness in terms of financial, and bringing them into the, the banked, so if you even merchants who are really really small merchants, I mean the vegetable vendors or anybody else who in the past would have only dealt with cash, is now suddenly be able to, take on digital payments and be able to be banked, so that they can now apply for other things, as as the government starts to look at, loans for small and MSMEs. Now there's a track record for these small merchants to go to the bank and say, look, here's my track record of payment, it's in your bank account, and be able to show them that they are actually a viable business and worthy of getting a loan. So I think there are all kinds of tertiary positive effects of innovation of this sort that's actually bringing the rest of the country into the economy, the mass economy, and a good thing, right? I mean, both for us as consumers, because now we don't have to risk ourselves. You don't need to deal with cash. You have no idea who's touched it. You don't know what's attached to it. And so without that, now you can pull out your phone. You can leave your home without a wallet, and just carry your phone with you and be able to transact, at scale, right? And it's a huge bonus, and it's not just any one app, because UPI has completely democratized the fact that you don't need, you don't need a particular app or a particular bank or a particular card or whatever to in order to actually participate in the economy and be able to do transactions, and which is good for both the consumer and the merchant who's actually accepting this. Okay, so again, again another example of where innovation probably didn't start during a crisis, but has massively accelerated during the crisis. And so every one of these innovation touch points, you never know where it's going to take off. And so continuing to innovate is a very, very key part of what we need to do. Next slide, please. So why is that, right? I mean, why are crisis and innovation linked together? And if you could just click through to the next slide, to the next animation of that, please. If you think about the three vectors of which are triangle, really, I mean, three sides of a triangle, which is time, cost, and quality. You can't control all three and be able to optimize, right? I mean, I wish we could, but most of the time you have to pick one or the other. But in the time of a crisis, you are in an existential situation. I mean, you don't know what the story is going to look like tomorrow, right? I mean, that's the reason why we also call it a crisis. So, so existential situation drives a certain mindset. One, time becomes of essence. You are constantly trying to accelerate. What is it that you're trying to do in a very short period of time, right? Because time is of essence. I mean, I talked about some of the examples like my labs. We came out with a test kit, a few weeks, and then it could mass manufacture and get it out there because time was of essence to start mass testing. Second, you're always constrained for resources. I mean, cost becomes a challenge. You're always your organization is trying to constrain costs. So low cost or constrained innovation is always a very fertile bed for like massive innovation cycles. And so, this and the focus then becomes on quality because you can't afford to make mistakes, right? I mean, you can't afford because of the existential situation. You need to be clear that you're going to produce something, and what is it that you're going to produce? You sharpen your focus considerably. And I think that is one of the advantages of a crisis situation is, I mean, it has got a lot of other disadvantages, but one of the big advantage of a crisis situation is the fact that it completely focuses you. You're not distracted by all kinds of choices and options and good things happening, etc. You're very, very focused. You know what you know what is going to help you survive, and then you try to do what you need to do in that constrained time frame with only the resources that you have at your disposal. And so that leads to better quality in a lot of ways in terms of the innovation quality. Go to the next slide. So, what is it? This is a good quote here. It says that, the secret of change is to focus all your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new, right? I mean, a lot of us would love to roll back to January 2020 or December 2019 and say, look, you know what? Let me just get back. I mean, we keep hearing this term called the new normal. I would argue that the new normal is yet to be created. We don't even know what the new normal is going to look like. I don't even know what normal looks like at this point. If you're anything like me, I don't know what normal looks like because every day looks different. So I think the best way to think about this is to accept it. I think we are in a tear in the space-time fabric. And what do I mean by that? That, you may never go back, right? It may not be easy to just go back to where we used to be, roll back the last 6 months and say, hey, we're back, right? We're back to where we were. We won't be because a lot of things have changed. I mean, things have changed in our personal relationship. Now, how many of you look at your own relatives, close relatives, who say, hey, I'm going to come visit you, and you go, you know what? I don't know where you've been exposed, right? I mean, I'm not sure that I want you coming to my house. Let's just do a Zoom call. So many social settings now are happening in Zoom calls. So I think the social fabric is changing. How you think of a crust of relationships is changing. The work environment is changing. I mean, we don't know if many of us will, when, if at all, we will go back to our offices. We don't know how do we, what does this all mean, right? We can keep harking back to saying like, everything will roll back. We'll be back in the office. We'll be having those pantry chats over cups of tea, right? But it's not likely, it may or may not happen, right? Many of us may not have offices. Maybe companies will decide that they don't want people back in offices and they don't need offices at all, right? I mean, we continue to work from home and then we'll meet at the closest hotel or something to have an offsite. And we don't know, right? I mean, everything is up for grabs at this point. So the thing to do here is to take a look in the future and say, look, what should we be building towards rather than what used to be? I'm not saying forget everything you had. I think there are some great things that were there, as we look back over the last 6 months ago. Let's bring those forward, but let's reframe what the new is going to look like. And I think that's the whole essence of the statement, which I think was very apt, right? So moving to the next slide. So how do we go about doing this? I think, there's a three-step process in my opinion, right? There is, and I'll double click on this in a second. One is, rediscover. I mean, you can discover the new normal and you can discover what the future will look like, but the rediscovery journey is very critical. It's okay. Please go to the next slide. the rediscovery journey is very critical. And this has few stages to it, right? One is analyze the landscape, not just today's landscape, but kind of look ahead and say, okay, what is it likely to look like? What is the, we may not be 100% accurate, but you still need to look ahead and say, what could that new world look like as we start to settle in around this crisis? And maybe the pandemic doesn't go away, right? Maybe we just learn to live with it in a period of time, which may change the way behavioral changes around it. How do we interact with people? How do we meet people? Is mask the full time thing now? So which means that now you're going to get stylish in terms of what you're going to wear. It's going to get comfortable. We're going to get air conditioned masks. There's a whole bunch of innovation that's likely to happen around that. It's already happening, right? And then identify what really matters out of that landscape. What is likely to work for us, and what is it so critical that we need to do, and then prioritize and start innovating. Because innovation is a cyclical process. I think Seema talked about it. We don't know what that's going to look like, but the faster you iterate, and the faster you kind of keep your customer base in the center of it, the faster you will discover something that is actually sticky, right? As we look at it. So the second stage, if you look at it, if you move to the next slide, is about how do we adapt. We have learned something new. We're going to adapt to the new realities as we look ahead. And really, the evolution is to take advantage of the tectonic shifts. Number one, I have three examples here. One, in the retail space, what does brick and mortar retail going to look like in the future? Is it just for pickup? Is it for delivery? If you look at restaurants today, it's only takeout, right? I mean, they only give you delivery. There's no, or at least in many cases, the restaurant is only delivery. There is no meals anymore in the restaurant, right? And the same thing with retail. You can get things delivered. I just this morning I got something donezoed from a shop that I needed. I didn't want to go out, and I got it taken out. So it's still from a brick and mortar shop. It's just that I didn't go to the brick and mortar shop. I just got it delivered to me. Second is telemedicine, right? Has telemedicine gone viral? I mean, there were regulatory aspects. I mean, the thing is important here also to note that the governments also have to change. I mean, there have been a lot of regulations in India, for example. You couldn't work from home. You couldn't work from home with respect to if you're in a telecenter space, right, where you do customer support. There was no way you could work from home. Department of Telecommunications had a law that basically said you cannot use a soft phone from your house. And this was changed on March 24th, I think, at close to late in the evening, when we were going to go to work from home the next day. The government gave an approval that basically said you can work from home now for a period of time, and it's a limited period of time that has now been extended at least twice. Our many of us work in bonded offices where the customs duty has been waived on equipment that we have, and they allowed us to take it out. And so many of us have our office equipment now in our houses, and this was not allowed before. Telemedicine was something similar. Telemedicine wasn't really, it was a gray area from a regulatory perspective, and that has changed now. I think government is now allowing healthcare professionals to deliver remote telemedicine based treatment. And so, will we ever go back to walking into a clinic, or will we just continue to do telemedicine? Right? I mean, it becomes an inclusive thing, because now we can get inclusion of people who the doctors couldn't touch in the past, right? The third area is around video conference. I mean, we live this on a daily basis. Zoom has become a verb, right? I mean, like Xerox, yes, photocopying Xerox was associated with that. Zoom, or you can pick your favorite video conference tool, whether it's WebEx or Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever. It is now ubiquitous, but it is also tiring. I mean, it is much harder to sit in front of your computer all day long on a video conference where people can tell whether you're sleeping or you're distracted or you're doing something else than if you were in a conference room in your office and you could hide in the back and nobody would notice. So very different paradigms and the shifts around that. So let's go to the next slide. If you could move to the next slide, Ramya. Okay. So no, sorry, go back one slide. Okay. So here's, just picking an example of work from anywhere, right? I mean, there are some positive effects of work from anywhere that is coming up, very quickly. One is the fact that it has a potential in looking at, what happens to things like commercial real estate? Like I talked about the fact that many offices, many companies are looking at downsizing. Startups are looking at this and going, why do I need an office anymore? I can just have everybody work from home, and then we will figure out a way to get together when we need to get together. So it's completely reframing what a North Star would look like. Even large companies, right? I mean, we have, every day there are some examples that are coming up of companies that are seriously looking at their real estate portfolio and saying, why do I need so much? We will have people work from anywhere. And if you have to do that, that has a positive effect. It democratizes talent availability. Now think about, work from anywhere. In the past, you had to move somewhere for your job, right? And that is changing quite dramatically, where jobs are now coming to people wherever they are. Now imagine that is completely going to change the talent landscape as we look into the future. There are a lot of people who felt that for personal reasons, they couldn't either stay in the workforce. Like we have that with a lot of women who have to leave the workforce because of their family obligations or something else has changed in their life, or they have to move away from where they were working earlier. And so they may take a break, but now they don't need to. I mean, they could still choose to take a break if that's what they want to do. But it should not be because of the fact that they actually had to move somewhere. We could still keep them in the workforce, and that's a big force multiplier. We can look at availability of talent in smaller towns and cities, right? Who needed to stay there for whatever personal reasons, but they had, they can have availability of that. So you can work from anywhere, literally, right? As long as you have an internet connection. And in some cases, what we are finding with many of our employees is that they have moved back to their hometowns, where their families were, and they are finding that they have faster internet connectivity in those towns than they did when they were staying in Bangalore. So there are all these interesting notions that are coming up. And then finally, forging unlikely collaborations. We're seeing this on a daily basis. Companies are coming together. They're melting their boundaries in order to come together to solve a larger problem. We are seeing traditional companies that used to compete are now, saying, okay, there are things that we could do together. Let's figure out a way to do it. And we saw this with Apple and Google. They came together to do the Bluetooth, for mobile phones for contact tracing. They said, look, this is not working individually. Let's get together and create a platform that everybody can adopt and be able to do this at scale. So, unlikely collaborations are starting to show up, and that may be the way of the future, where really the focus, everybody does well by collaborating rather than by just competing in the market and trying to do a zero sum. So all these are examples of where work from anywhere, type platforms, etc., are going to change the way we work and the way we collaborate and the way we discover new talent. We harness a whole range of new people into the workforce. And then moving on to the next slide. So what is it that we can do at a personal level, right? I mean, I think that's one of the key questions that comes up is what is it that we can do individually? One, I think we have to shift to becoming a problem solver, right? It is no longer, we have to learn to create and derive problem statements out of what is around us. It's no longer good to say, look, I'm going to wait for somebody to tell me what to do. You have to develop the skill set to do this. Irrespective of your job function, it doesn't matter what it is. The ability to analyze a situation, coming up with problem statement is going to be very, very critical. Second, unite for a purpose, right? Sometimes you have to check in your day job, check in your hat, and you come together with others in order for a larger purpose. Women Who Code is a great platform of an example of uniting for a purpose around a team. Practice, Bhuja Day. That's the opposite of deja vu in the sense that look back, but at the same time, look forward. Look forward and learn from history, like I talked about, and then bring that forward into new things, new way of looking at things. Don't fight the old, right? Don't get into this thing of saying I want to roll back to something in the past. Bring forward the good things that were there, but rediscover new things that we need to do. Cultivate outside in perspectives. A lot of people, want to become entrepreneurs. I mean, I think that one of the key skills that you need to build, and you don't need to be an entrepreneur as like doing a startup. You could be an intrapreneur in a company where you are actually looking for new opportunities or creating new opportunities. Develop the ability to create an outside in perspective. Put yourself in the shoes of your customers, of the other person, so that you're able to discover something different than your own biases and your own perspectives. So it's really a way to kind of get rid of your own personal biases that may influence the situation. And then last but not least, continue to learn, right? I mean, there is no There is no dearth of ability to learn at this point. You don't need to go attend a class in person anymore. There's just massive amounts of information. In fact, it becomes a hard challenge in prioritizing for yourself as to where to learn, what to learn, and move forward. But the key of all of this is the fact that you have to reskill yourself. You have to change the way you think. You have to change. You have to take on the perspective that, look, I need to be a change enabler, and the only way to do that is to follow these 5 steps that I just outlined. All right. Thank you. And I think they have one last slide, which really to kind of leave you with the theme that basically says, you can't stop the waves. I mean, none of us could have in the whole pandemic. I mean, um, if you think about the entire weight of a COVID-19, virus, and you add it all up to the number of cases that exist in the world, you will find that the sum total of that virus is about less than 5 grams. Right? Imagine that less than 5 grams of a virus in total has brought the world to its knees. So that's not a wave that we're going to be able to stop, very, very, very easily. But we can certainly learn to surf these waves. Don't think about everything as a massive barrier in front of you. Figure out a way to get around it, get through it, get over it, right? And the way to do that is, some of the things that I talked about in the talk. Thank you very much. And it's always hard to do this so I love to get the interaction going. So I'd love to take some questions if we have still have time. Over to you, Shilpa.
Yeah, thank you, Ram, for the wonderful insights. So the key takeaways that I consider is, firstly, every crisis can be considered as an opportunity to innovate, and we need to evolve and adapt to new realities. Right? So one of the questions that came up from the audience is, if you have an idea to solve a necessity, where should we start to implement it?
Well, first of all, I think I would take a step back and say, if you have an idea, you have to test it against, is it really an idea that is worth solving? And which starts with creation of that problem statement. So that's why I said, you start with the problem statement, you frame it in the way of a problem and say, is it worth solving? And if you're going to solve it for somebody, it's worth testing it against those people to see, is it worth solving for those people? Because ultimately, the proof point that you have, whether you're on a good idea or not, is by your intended audience saying, yes, it's a problem worth solving for me. That's the only way we're going to do this. And the analogy I would give, and forgive me for the analogy, but it's a great analogy, which is, will the dog eat the dog food? You may have a great idea for a new dog food, but if the dogs walk away from it, I don't think it's a good idea. So, so I think we all work in the tech industry, and dog fooding is a common term. But I think the proof of the pudding is always in the fact whether your customer is actually adopting it or not.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ram. Thank you for joining us today. It was great having you here.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure, and all the best to everybody, and stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thank you. So next we have a couple of sessions, and please note that the next sessions will be on the sessions, not on stage.